Greetings and welcome back to the Grimm Reader. I come to you today with a short review of one of my recent reads, and it's a German text by the early 19th century author Adelbert von Chamisso. And the title of the story is Peter Schlemihl's wundersame Geschichte, Peter Schlemihl's miraculous story. And so it's in the tradition of German Romanticism. It's novella length, and it's, well, you could call it a fairy tale or a folk tale, but it's a literary folk tale in the sense that it is really just the work of Chamisso. And in German, there's this term Kunstmärchen, so artistic fairy tale. And there's a wide range of those. I mean, even Hans Christian Andersen's tales are basically his own imagination. They're not really traditional folk tales in that sense. But the difference between his tales and even this one is that they're more childlike, I would say. They more really are kind of meant for children. Whereas the German romantic fairy tales are often not meant. They're not really for children. And the Grimm tales are kind of their own thing, their own genre, so to speak, almost. And they are more for children, but it took a long time for them to become acceptable for children. So his story, Peter Schlemihl, is this sort of Schlemihl, this unlucky character. And the kind of central plot element is that he sells his shadow to a mysterious gray man in a gray coat who does turn out to be satanic or the devil. So it's this exchange, this kind of Faustian. He gets talked into doing it because what he's going to get for this shadow seems to be worth it, and that is a never-ending sack of gold pieces. And so you see right there that we're in the midst of this folkloric world of the shadowless man, the man without a shadow, and the never-ending sack of gold, the never-ending pot of money. And there are many, many origins, or sort of, there's the main origin story of the never-ending sack of money is Fortunatus, it's a early German novel, 1509, so a very long time ago. But Fortunatus is his name because he gets his sack of gold from Fortune, the goddess Fortune. And they're on Cyprus, so it's like somewhere else. And so what Chamisso has done with this tale is he embeds it in the kind of romantic context of, it starts out with a bunch of letters that he writes to people, his friends, his actual historical friends. He had a lot of close friends, one of the main ones being Julius Eduard Hitzig, a Jewish man from sort of, they called him in German Hofjuden, he had been, at the court. Anyway, that's his best friend. So actual historical people who existed, and they're talking about Schlemihl as if he's also one of their people that they know about, and they're talking about. So he embeds it in kind of this meta narrative of, this, the sort of gossipy almost. This is what happened to Schlemihl, which I think is kind of interesting, kind of giving it a fake, realistic frame. And so we follow throughout the story the sort of the premise that he gives up his shadow for money. He thinks it's a good bargain, and of course pretty soon he figures out it's not a good bargain because he's completely ostracized because he has no shadow. And I do think that's a bit of a sort of an interesting point, because I keep sort of wondering, just at the basic level, would people even notice if you don't have a shadow? I don't think they would. But yet, in the context of the story, they all notice it, and they almost sort of, he gets outcast completely because he has no shadow. And so he ends up having to sort of go around at night, and he uses his money basically to save himself from any kind of unfortunate encounter with the outer world. So it's as if the money is what allows him to be a loner and be kept comfortable and within. It's a very sort of weird situation. So the money doesn't help at all. I mean, it only kind of makes it more bearable, but it doesn't really bring him any kind of happiness or anything of what he thought. It was clearly a bad thing that he did, or a mistake. He has two servants. One of them is completely faithful and really kind of his friend, Bendel, and he has another servant called Rascal, who does betray him. And so we follow his adventures. It's written in a sort of romantic style, so it is a little effusive. It's not sort of minimalist writing, lots of adjectives, but it fits the story, and it is sort of amusing, even if it's a little over the top. You have to kind of go with it a little bit, I would say. It reminds me, I mean, the other famous artistic fairy tale that is also from this time period, a little bit earlier even. I mean, there's all the stories by E.T.R. Hoffmann, but the one I'm thinking of is Undine, the story about the water sprite / person by de la Motte Fouquet. So sort of German, and there's plenty of other tales like this. Teague and who's the other person? Yeah, Teague, and then there's other people who wrote them. Let's see. So what happens is that the gray man kind of keeps coming back into his life and sort of saying, hey, you want to sell your shadow back? And so in a certain sense, the gray man becomes the hated shadow and follows him around, and he doesn't like him because he kind of does sense that he's satanic. And so the gray man becomes his new hated shadow. And then what happens is that he does undergo a sort of internal transformation, in the sense that he at some point he just throws the money away. And at that point, it's sort of, there's this irony of having to sell his pretty but impractical footwear for more practical footwear, so he could walk the world and be a poor person, or at least someone who doesn't have a lot of money. And the boots that he gets, here we get another famous folklore motif, are the 7-league boots, with which he can walk around the world. And so that's another sort of very famous folk motif. Tom Thumb, which I know mostly from Perrault, the French story about the little thumbling, and he gets the 7-league boots too, and that's how he kills the giant. So Schlemihl gets these boots, and he kind of transforms himself into someone who can walk the world and explore the world, and he is actually pretty happy doing that. He becomes a kind of explorer because of having these boots. And so there's this kind of sense of, well, he learned his lesson. He learned how to at least be more content with everything by giving up what he thought he wanted most, which is sort of the moral of the story. Yeah, and it's very entertaining, a fairly quick read, not very long. And I'm going to post a link to a Goodreads site with a copy of a bunch of sort of strange German stories, which this is one of. And I want to finish the video with a little bit of biographical information about Chamisso, because his life was so interesting. He was born at the end of the 18th century, 1781, and lived to 1838, so not very long, as the fourth son of a French duke. So he's basically French. But the family had to flee France because of the revolution, and the family being of nobility. And they end up in Berlin, kind of part of the French diaspora. A lot of them are Huguenots who'd come earlier from France. And he attends a French grammar school. He's page to the later Prussian queen. So he becomes kind of he becomes German. He serves in the Prussian army. He changes his French name Louis to Ludwig. That was his actual name. But then he sort of falls in. He's always been interested in literature and poetry. He falls in with other a romantic group of writers and poets, and sort of reinvents himself as Adelbert von Chamisso. He also spent time with the group around Madame de Staël, the French woman of letters, who later on had her estate in Coppet, I think, Switzerland. And she was like a salonier, had lots of people come and hang out with her and have good times together. And then he was also his sort of job in a way was as a naturalist or botanist, and he also did he worked as a zoologist too, and he was an explorer. He was able to take part in a fairly famous expedition around the world, funded by a Russian man, I think, something connected to Russia. But then the captain of the voyage is Otto von Kotzebue, who I think is the son of the playwright August von Kotzebue. And he's on that expedition, and he writes a book, a travel diary of that expedition. And he apparently did all kinds of interesting things. He went to San Francisco and studied the birds. He mapped Alaska, the coastline of Alaska, and he also kind of was able to. He critiqued the Russian colonization stuff going on up there in Alaska, and I think there's some islands called the Chamisso Islands. He also has quite a few plants, I think, named after him, even an asteroid, I found out. So very interesting man, and sort of a typical romantic man of everything, Renaissance man is what we would say. So scientist, explorer, writer, poet, and very interesting fellow. Hope you liked this little review of the story. I do recommend it, especially if you're interested in the time period. And I also recommend checking out a little bit more about his biography. I found out that I could get a German copy of his Diary of the World Expedition for free on Kindle in German. So yeah, it's an interesting, if you're interested in the 19th century and sort of the French-German kind of what's going on there, I would recommend checking out Adelbert von Chamisso. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon. Bye-bye.